In ACA, we say that shame is the legacy of adult children and that it's passed down through the generations. And that's why we feel shame for something that normal people wouldn't feel ashamed about, or we feel a magnitude of shame that is greater than normal people because we're adult children. And that's because it's the shame of generations that we're feeling. Hi, I'm Barb Nangle. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole, Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, where I help people heal their emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds and make deep, lasting changes in their lives. I'm the founder and CEO of Higher Power Coaching and Consulting. I'm a boundaries coach who specializes in helping women who are focused on what others are thinking and doing and neglect themselves in the process. And I have coached hundreds of people on how to build healthy boundaries using my exclusive Build framework. On this podcast, I share my experience, strength, and hope from recovery. I don't support or endorse any particular 12-step recovery fellowship, and I don't claim to speak for any particular 12-step fellowship. I also don't believe that 12-step recovery is the only way to recover. You might need additional help. I'm an avid beachcomber who collects sea glass, shells, wood, and stones. I am a formerly closeted fan of the Hallmark Channel, especially the Christmas movies. Hello, Christmas in July. I wear fingerless gloves from September to June because my hands are always cold, so I have about 15 pairs. And I get a huge kick out of counting how many days, weeks, and months there are until my birthday or Christmas at completely random times of the year. My hope is that you'll find my words concretely helpful in improving your life, whether you're in recovery or not. If you like what you've heard on this episode, please screenshot it and share it on your social media and tag me at Higher Power Coaching. This is episode 278, Breaking Free from Generational Shame and Humiliation. Shame has been on my mind a lot lately. So about a week ago, I started jotting down all these different memories from my life where I felt shamed, thinking I'll do something with it for a podcast. Until I got into recovery, I really honestly didn't realize that that flood of shitty chemicals going through my body was shame. For me, shame is the worst. Well, actually, humiliation is the worst. I think of that as public shame. I'd honestly rather be terrified than humiliated. So I'm just going to riff on this and see what comes out of me. I know that people say that guilt is I did something wrong and that shame is I am something wrong. But for me, it's more frequently that I'm supposed to know something and I don't, or I'm supposed to be or do something that I'm not. In ACA, we say that shame is the legacy of adult children and that it's passed down through the generations. And that's why we feel shame for something that normal people wouldn't feel ashamed about, or we feel a magnitude of shame that is greater than normal people because we're adult children. And that's because it's the shame of generations that we're feeling. The way that I think of it is it's almost like my ancestors' shame was poured down into me. I do have a previous episode about shame that I will link in the show notes. In that episode, I talk about what I did to stop a huge flood of shame in the moment. But when I think about why I'm not riddled with shame anymore, or why is it only like a teeny tiny little fraction of what it used to be, I think it has to do with feeling really whole now, getting to know myself, like and love myself, having made amends for the things I did in the past that weren't so great, changing my behavior. It's all the recovery stuff. I am okay with who I am now. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I'm not afraid to make mistakes anymore. I'm not afraid to say that I'm wrong, whereas those were just not possible for me before. There are some specific examples of how the shame was passed down through my family, and this is not to blame them. They just did what was done to them. I mean, it's not okay, but This is not about casting aspersions. That's why it's so important to deal with the intergenerational nature of family dysfunction so we can stop passing it down to future generations. So now I'm going to share some specific memories that stand out for how the shame was passed down for me. So one of the things that my dad would say that would just kill me was, "I'm disappointed in you." And that was often followed by, "You should know better." I remember as a teen talking to one of my friends and saying, "I think I'd rather be hit than have my father tell me that he was disappointed in me." And as an adult, I think the reason that I thought that is that hitting ends, disappointment lasts forever. And I remember my father being disappointed in me a lot. Then there's my older brother who is super fucking smart, incredibly well read. I think he was an intellectual at like 5. He knows the most random things, but he also knows like really big, deep, important things. He understands things like socio-political and historical stuff and science and you name it. So I grew up with him 2 years ahead of me in school and had to get the teacher's expectations in line with who I was, which was not a younger version of Steve. I remember saying to him numerous times, "How the fuck do you know that?" And he would go, "I read, Barbara. I read." Now, I didn't really read much as a kid, and honestly, looking back, I think it was almost like a rebellion against being like him. I did not want to be like him. And I had this idea my whole life, like Steve is the smart one in the family. And once I got in recovery, I was like, wait, it's not like there's a limit on the number of smart people there can be in a family. It wasn't until I was 24 that I finally realized that I was smart. Now, I never thought I was dumb, but I didn't really feel smart. And I'm sure that it had to do with comparing was to Steve. And realizing that I was smart happened when I took a class through a local community college after hours at the warehouse where I was working. It was an introductory business class, and I did extremely well in it. And there are several factors that led to me doing so well in that class. So I had an income since I was 11. So the things we were studying in the business class were things I understood because I had 13 years of experience working in the world by then. But I didn't know that these were things that had names and that you could learn about them in a class and that people study them. So the material was familiar to me. I was pretty much done with working in places like retail and warehouses and started realizing, maybe there is something to this whole education thing that my father's been trying to cram down my throat. So I was highly motivated to get an education. And third, there was a really good textbook. So it had any terms that were unfamiliar bold-faced in the text, and then they were defined in the margin. So if you didn't know what something meant, you could just literally look over to the side and read the definition. So I was super motivated. All these circumstances came together for me to do extremely well in the class. I also think that before that, I may have had a reading comprehension problem. I was also high all the time too, so maybe that was it. I don't know. But in that class, I decided if I have to read this text 7 times, I'm going to do it until I get it. And I felt like I somehow broke through whatever reading comprehension barrier I may have had. I did continue to smoke weed very heavily for many years after that, so maybe it was the weed. Well, in that class, every time we had a test, the professor gave extra credit, so you could get more than 100. And one of the times he was passing back the tests, he held up my test and said out loud to the class, "This is the lowest grade that Barb Nangle has gotten." And it was like 103 or something. Now, you might think that that would be something to be proud of, but no, not in a warehouse. Where I worked, being smart, not cool. So I learned that I was smart by getting this external feedback, but at the same time, it was fucking humiliating to me. I stood out in that warehouse in a way that was not cool. Anyway, back to my brother. Another thing I remember very specifically that he said when I asked him about state level government, I understood and do still understand at the national level the difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives. But at the state level, I was like, how are the House and the Senate set up? Because the population is the population of the state of Connecticut. And he goes, how the fuck do you not know that, Barbara? That's literally the way that he spoke to me. Like I just murdered somebody or something. These are just a couple of the things that I remember hearing and, messages that I got from my family. I can't imagine how many things I don't remember. So I got messages like, you should know better. I'm disappointed in you. How the fuck do you not know that? And I internalized the message that I should know things or be things that I had no idea about. Now that the context has been laid, I'm going to list in no particular order things that have made me feel shame over the years. So, something that's going on currently is that there's something wrong with my dishwasher where the drinking glasses often come out with almost like sand in the bottom of them. No other dishes, just the drinking glasses. And I know for a fact that if that had happened when someone was my guest before recovery, I would feel absolutely humiliated and full of shame if they pulled a glass out of the dishwasher like that. Like, I'm a horrible person because my dishwasher isn't working effectively. I'm pretty sure that I talked about this in that other episode about shame. So I had this birthmark on my head, which was actually a collection of oil glands. And I ended up having to have it surgically removed. That's why I say had. But every single time I went to get my hair cut when I was growing up, I would get this flood of shame and feel like, oh my God, they're going to see it or they're going to say something. And because it was a collection of oil glands, no hair grew on it. You couldn't really see it unless you were cutting my hair or brushing my hair. But I didn't understand until I'd been in recovery for a while that feeling that I was having was shame. I didn't really understand that. Okay, this is a weird one that I really still don't understand. But before recovery, with every man I ever dated, I always wanted to use terms of endearment like honey, sweetheart, baby, darling, but I just couldn't fucking do it. I would practically like gag or choke every time I would try to do it. And there was this one guy in particular that I remember dating that called me babe all the time, babe and baby all the time. And I just sort of felt like, like I need to do it. And I couldn't. It was like, I remember going like, babe, like a couple of times, but it was just felt like so like shameful and humiliating. But again, I didn't know at the time that was shame. That one really just came into my consciousness. And I don't still understand what that was about. In my relationship with my sweetheart now, I call him terms of endearment all the time, and it just comes out naturally and easily for me. So recovery had something to do with that. The next is basically shame for not knowing something, and that could be just about anything. It didn't really matter what types of things. They could be things that, given my age, life experience, and education, that no one would expect anyone in my position to know those things. Now, there are no examples popping in my mind right now. And by the way, I don't feel shame about that. I don't know what the examples are. But I definitely grew up with the feeling that I was supposed to know everything. And if I didn't know something, I would basically make an educated guess because that was better than not knowing. And then I would act like whatever this guess was that I made, I'd act like it was handed down from God. And then I would defend it as if it was the truth. And I'd be all defensive because I didn't want people to know that I made that shit up or that I guessed at it. Another thing was that I declared bankruptcy in 1999 when my student loans came due. And that was because I had so much damn credit card debt. That was codependence. I developed all those large bills because I was managing my image to other people, which, by the way, is about shame, not feeling good enough. I'd also rescue, fix, and save people. I would buy their affection. So that's how I racked up all that debt. And it took me years to be able to tell people that I declared bankruptcy. And the fact that I can publicly discuss it on a podcast and have done it many times on this and other podcasts is just like insane to me. If you had ever told me that like 25 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. Another source of shame was if somebody criticized me or I even perceived them as criticizing me. For my whole life, that was just like an arrow to the heart with a poison tip that floods all those shame chemicals through my system. Now, when someone criticizes me, I might get a little hot or have a tiny little trickle of shame, but it's not the gigantic flood that it used to be because I am blossom. Here's another one. When I was in grad school, I lived with this guy and we partied a lot in our neighborhood. I mean, like got drunk and high like all the time. And on Tuesday nights, the women in the neighborhood would get together and play games. So we became really friendly. And one year for my birthday or Christmas, I don't remember which, they gave me this book that was called something like The Smart Person's Thesaurus, but it wasn't a compliment. And I was just humiliated. And the guy that was my boyfriend at the time was like, oh, well, it's probably because they're intimidated by you, which didn't really make me feel any better. I got the message from these women that I was like too smart for my britches or something, which is really hilarious since most of my life I had lived under my brother's intellectual shadow. And these were really smart, educated women. Speaking of smart, I remember in first grade feeling really dumb because I was in a spelling bee. It was just in my classroom. It wasn't like a public one. And there was some really easy word, like a 4 or 5 letter word, and I fucked it up and I felt like I wanted to die. Let's see. When I first started working at Yale, one of the bosses I worked for raked me over the coals in front of a colleague for like 40 minutes. She asked me if I had a learning disability. She called my competence, my intellect, and my work ethic into question. And again, 40 minutes in front of another colleague. And by the way, that colleague and the boss were both clinical psychologists. And I just wanted to die right on the spot. That was really, really hard for me, not just because of what she was saying, but also because I always had excellent evaluations at every job I have ever had. I've been a better worker than like 95% of the people that I worked with. I always ended up training new people at whatever job I was at. Mind you, this was at Yale, which was at the beginning of my career, whereas everything else before then had been jobs, and then I was a grad student. But still, I'd always had excellent evaluations. So this was just horrifying for me. Another childhood memory was that my dad came home from the package store, which is what we call liquor stores here in Connecticut, which is, yes, a dumb name, especially when you're a kid. Because when I was a kid, to me, a package was a gift. So I always wanted to go to the package store to get gifts, and I couldn't understand why they wouldn't allow me to go. And I always wanted to know, like, why are they coming home from the package store with beer? So one time he came home with a room temperature 6-pack of Michelob beer and gave it to me and said, I want you to go in the house and take the Michelobs that are in the refrigerator out, put these bottles back where those were, and then put the other bottles in front of them and take one of those other bottles and bring it to me. And I was little enough that I didn't understand he meant for me to rotate out the cold stuff to the front and put the warm stuff in the back. And so I was like, that's way too much fucking work. So I just put the new ones in the front of the old ones, brought him a new one, and was astonished that he knew immediately that I didn't rotate them out. He was like, you didn't do what I asked you to do. Now, I had no idea how he knew. Then he told me, this one is warm. It's not cold, which is why I asked you to do all that. And I remember feeling like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't know that. All right, next one. When I got laid off from Yale and went on unemployment, my unemployment was less than half of my salary. And I forgot to stop all of the auto payments I had going on. So a whole boatload of things bounced, and I had to go to the credit union in person. And I remember being absolutely fucking humiliated. I was shaking and trying really hard not to cry. I told the teller, like, I forgot to stop the auto payments right before I came here. I stopped them all. I just hadn't thought to do that. And I wanted to die from shame right there in the credit union. Let's see, when I was in seventh or eighth grade, there was this kid in chorus who would make fun of me at least once, but in my mind, it was a whole bunch of times. And it was because I have some chicken pox scars on my face from when I was 5. And I remember at the time thinking, this is something I'm going to have to live with my whole life. People making fun of me for chicken pox scars, which, by the way, didn't happen after that. But I remember wanting to die from that. One of the most humiliating incidents of my entire life, which I believe I may have already talked about elsewhere on this podcast, was when I was 7. My dad decided that it was time for me to learn how to ride my bike without training wheels. And 7 was ancient in my neighborhood because all the other kids were like 4, maybe 5 by the time they learned to ride their bikes without training wheels. So my dad decided it was time and he was going to make me learn how to ride the bike without training wheels. Now, in my mind, every kid in the neighborhood was there, but maybe it was only a couple. I know my brother was there for sure. My dad put me on my bike and just pushed me, and I was not ready, and I was super fucking scared, and I just started flailing and screaming, and then because I'm flailing, I don't have my hands on the handlebars, and guess what? I wiped out. So I got physically hurt. I was publicly humiliated, and of course, my dad yelled at me because that's what he did. So it was just awful. Then, to make matters worse, for years, my older brother made fun of that. So it really just magnified the humiliation and dragged it out over the years. In fact, just last week, my brother sent me a text about that incident. Maybe that's why I decided to start writing things about shame down. Good point. So this brother and I have a thread of a relationship, by the way. And this is what he said. I heard this wild noise outside and went to look, and it was a little boy riding a bike. And I remembered that time when you got nervous and let go of the handlebars. So I got like a little tiny trickle of some feelings about it. I did not have a flood of shame, but I did write back to my brother and said, that was a very traumatizing experience for me. Please don't bring it up again. I haven't heard from him since, but hopefully he got the message. It's literally been decades since he mentioned it. Okay, for the guys who are listening, you may not want to hear this, but the whole menstruation thing and the whole tampon thing was just piles and piles of humiliation and shame for decades. I'm so happy that I've been in menopause for years. I almost forget that I used to menstruate. I felt like I should have been born knowing how to use tampons and what to do about them when you're having sex. I eventually decided to never have sex again when I had my period because it was just too gross and too fucking humiliating. The whole menstruation thing was just a humiliating experience, especially if you got blood on your clothes. Like, ugh, that was the worst. Okay, guys, you probably are going to want to hear this part. Before I started having sex, the only thing I ever heard in regard to oral sex was expressions like, suck my dick, or blow me. So the idea of giving head was not going to happen because all I heard was these like humiliating, horrendous, insulting expressions. And then I started having sex with my boyfriend and he went down on me and I was like, ooh, this is amazing. And he was like, you really need to return the favor. And so I agreed. And to my surprise, I was like, oh my God, I love this. But I was so embarrassed that I actually liked giving head. All I'd ever heard was these humiliating sayings about it. So I felt so gross and shitty and shameful that I liked it. As I got a little older, other women would often talk about how much they hated giving head, which reinforced for me that I shouldn't like it. But the fact is, I fucking love it and it's very erotic to me. Now, over time, I have found that there are many other women like me, but for the longest time, it was so embarrassing. So that is just a sampling of things for which I have felt shame and humiliation over the course of my life. That's a nice wide range of examples, both in time and in type. And I don't have a neat little bow to tie this up here. This episode is really about sharing that I don't get humiliated and shameful by things like this the way I used to. I can literally list them out on a podcast and feel pretty good about it, which is really like a series of miracles. I want to share this with others so they have hope that someday they can also release their carried shame. There was no one specific aspect of my recovery that got me over the shame. I think it's all of it. I know who I am. I'm comfortable with who I am. I don't feel like I have to negotiate the boundaries of Barb anymore. I know where I end and other people begin. I allow myself to like the things that I like and to dislike the things that I dislike. I'm not hyper super invested in what other people think of me anymore. I care more now what I think of me. And while I'm saying that, that right there is the core of what enabled me to go from having no boundaries to having healthy boundaries. I stopped caring so much what other people thought of me and came to care way more what I think about me. Now, when I think of how I made that switch, it was a lot of things, but mainly it was the boundary building process because I got to know myself better as I figured out what I like and don't like, what's okay with me and what's not okay with me. And then I started having a better life because I stopped doing so much shit I didn't like and started doing more things that I do like. And it's kind of easy to grow to love somebody who's giving you a life that you really love. I built trust with myself through that process because I followed through for myself in ways that I never had before. And all of those things together got me to feel worthy, which has a lot to do with caring more what I think of me than what other people think of me. So I'll end on this. It's fine to seek others' approval, but only when you have your own approval first. So if you're thinking of doing something to get someone else's approval and you know you're going to feel like shit about it, don't do it. You're feeling overwhelmed because you're overcommitted and just can't keep up. You neglect yourself even though you know you should take better care of yourself, but you just don't have the time. You really want to say no, but just can't get yourself to do it because you don't want to come across as selfish or unhelpful. And you're pretending things are okay with you when they're really not. If this is you, we should talk. Go to barbchat.net and sign up for a free 30-minute call with me about my private coaching. This is for people who are finally ready to make deep, lasting changes in their lives, their relationship patterns, including their relationships with themselves, their partners, family, friends, and colleagues. That's barbchat.net. If you like this podcast, and I'm guessing you did because you're still listening, you will also love my weekly newsletter, Friday Fragments, which has short essays similar to the podcast. You can check it out at fridayfragments.news. That's fridayfragments.news. If you haven't already subscribed to my podcast on your favorite podcast outlet, please do that. It helps carry the message to more people. I started this podcast because there was so much wisdom in recovery that just wasn't making its way out into the world. So I want as many people as possible to hear it. I'd also love it if you'd leave a 5-star rating or a review, which you can do on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find it so they can get the benefits that you've gotten from listening. If someone in particular came to mind when you listen to this episode, please share it with them. And my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. Please DM me there. I'd love to hear what you got from this episode. I run private and group coaching programs on building healthy boundaries. Whether you need help with boundaries in your personal, professional, or romantic life, I can help. Head on over to barbchat.net where you can get on my calendar for a free 30-minute Better Boundaries consultation. I also do short-term situational coaching to help people make it through specific situations they're going through, such as divorce, empty nesting, preparing for retirement, or any phase where their identity is shifting. Regardless of the type of coaching, my ideal client is someone who is ripe for change. If that's you, I'd love to work with you. My goal with all my work is to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. Remember, it's never too late to recover. No one is beyond hope, and healing is possible. Thanks for listening.